Hey everybody, welcome to Sociology 206 Social Problems. I'm your professor, Dr. Randy Blazak, and we are going to have some video. We'll have some in-class time, but we'll also have some video lectures posted on D2L each week. There'll be between 1 and 3 lecture videos posted each week with, for most of them, not all of them, but for most of them, there'll be a corresponding lecture question. So the idea is you watch all of it, and then go to D2L and answer the lecture question and get your point for the lecture question. And so I'm really excited about the lecture videos because I get to present some of the content here. And the idea is you get kind of the more formal lectures here on D2L, and that frees up more time in the class for us to discuss because I hear my voice enough. I don't need to hear it all the time. I really want to hear your voices, especially on these issues. And so we're starting with a question. So this is our first lecture video. And the question is, what do you think of when you hear the word social problems? What comes to mind? What are the things that pop in your head? Could it be something that we would think on a micro level? Like something that personally affects you? Like, I can't find a good parking place when I go to downtown, or I'm having a hard time paying my rent, or I'm battling addiction. I mean, these are things that sort of affect us on a personal level, and we might think of them as micro. Or do you come up with things that are more macro, more societal level? Society is wrestling with issues around racism and sexism and poverty and the threat to democracy and the threat to women's reproductive. Do you come up with something that's sort of big in society level and shared by more people? There's no wrong answer. Both of them fit sort of our definition. So what we're going to kind of do today is define a little bit about how we sociologists, that's me, I'm a sociologist. You're a sociologist also because you're here with me. How we think about social problems. And in talking about social problems, we also think about what are the causes of the social problems. Why do bad things happen? Why are we plagued by things that are historic? Like, we've got a long history of dealing with poverty. It's not a new problem. But we also have new problems, like how we deal with AI, right? It's been increasingly framed as a problem, especially on colleges, and how we have students present their work as opposed to, just presenting something they got off ChatGPT. Like, this is a new problem that we have. So we think about the causes, and do the causes come from some spiritual realm? It's because of evil in the world that we have mass shooters. Is it because of personal individual pathologies? Bad people cheat and use ChatGPT. Or is it about some sort of societal level situation that benefits from having people who are houseless, or benefits from people who are experiencing poverty, or benefits from even crime? So we want to be able to think in kind of different terms about how we think about social problems, because we're going to be following kind of a model in this class, and you'll hear this multiple times. But we're going to talk about kind of like a formula that we're going to use in this class, which is we define a social problem, and that's kind of the topic of this discussion today. We define a social problem. We come up with a theory about why it's happening, what are the root causes of it. Then we do some research based on that theory, some sociological research, which we will talk a lot about in this class. And then that leads us to, once we gain some evidence that backs up the theory, to policy, that we can do something to reduce the problem. We don't solve problems, by the way. We got to kind of strike that language from our vocabulary. We're not capable of solving poverty. We're not capable of solving sexual violence, but we can reduce it. And the term that we're going to use, and I'm going to put it up on the screen because this is the magic phrase that pays. The term that we're going to use is mitigate. We can engage in social problem mitigation. We can mitigate a social problem, which means we can reduce the effect. That a gun law is not going to end school shootings, but it can reduce the number of people that are killed in school shootings. So we're interested in mitigation. That's the policy end. So problem, theory, research, policy. That's kind of our magic formula for this class. Okay, so let's talk about defining a social problem. Where do we start with that? We're gonna use kind of two criteria definition of defining what's a social problem, because there's a lot of things that we could define as a social problem that aren't. You can't get something that you were ordering online to your house in time. Is that a social problem? Starbucks is no longer carrying your favorite drink. Is that a social problem? Your significant other doesn't get your emojis. Is that a social problem? So we're going to use this as sort of our criteria to hang our hat on. So what's a social problem? Okay, you ready? So the first criteria is, does this problem cause suffering in the world? Not suffering with you individually. She doesn't understand. It was just a joke about sort of collective suffering. So these are kind of big ticket items. So we think about violence, for example. I mean, we talk a lot about violence in our society. It causes incredible amounts of suffering and trauma. We think about the biases that we have out there, transphobia and religious biases, and those cause widespread suffering. So the first question: does it cause some shared suffering? Not suffering for you individually, because you stepped on a tack. It's about a collective suffering. That's the first criteria. And then the second one, and this is where it gets kind of sociological: does it represent a discrepancy with our values? Does it represent a discrepancy with our values? What does that mean? Values are ideas of things that we think are important. And we think about American values. We think about the attainment of wealth as an American value. We value education. We value freedom. We value individual liberty. We value safety. We value democracy. I hope so anyway. Those are values that we share. So if there is somehow a threat to those values, so privacy is a big one in the United States. A lot of people don't care about privacy. Tribal societies don't really care too much about privacy. It's big for us. So when our information is shared online, when someone hacks into our social media and all of a sudden our private data is being shared by people, there's a discrepancy there, right? We care about privacy, and now all our private information is out there. So that would be a discrepancy. A really big one that we're talking a lot about these days is how we value democracy. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, there's generally a belief, unless you're a fascist or a communist, on the extremes, there is a belief that, we are empowered through our democratic process. The people that we elect are there to serve us. I mean, I think that's shared liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. Well, democracy is certainly under threat at the moment. All right, so there is a problem there. Are we about to lose this thing that we hold sacred in this country? So looking at the discrepancy around those values. So those are going to be our two criteria when we're thinking, are we going to define this as a social problem? Does it cause some shared suffering? And does it represent a discrepancy in our values? Also, when we're talking about social problems, sometimes we have to be careful, because sometimes when we're trying to define something as a problem, it may be a symptom of a larger problem. So, for example, one of the issues that is on the mind of a lot of people, and I think rightly so, is the high rate of suicide among transgender people. So transgender suicide is certainly something that we talk about as a social problem. But that may be a symptom of another larger problem, which is sort of transphobia in society in general, and how transgender people are marginalized and are more likely to experience mental health crisis because of a society that doesn't grant them full access. And so therefore it makes sense that their suicide rates would be elevated. So sometimes we're trying to tease out, are we looking at a social problem or a symptom of a larger social problem? Homelessness is certainly a problem in Portland, but it's also a symptom of a larger problem, which is the lack of affordable housing in this city. Right? That's even bigger problem, because it drives people to living in their car, and living in their shelters, and living on the street. Okay, so we are going to use this kind of framework and thinking about what's a social problem and what's not. Okay, let's talk about types of social problems. I want to go through a little bit of this. One way to talk about social problems is as norm violations. That something breaks the rules somehow, and it's then seen as a problem. So you can do this in a couple different ways. A norm violation can be a statistical norm violation. So, for example, most people are right-handed. So if you're left-handed, and I know some of you are out there, statistically you're deviant. And there was a time when that was defined as a problem, that left-handed people were of the devil. I mean, I, as a kid who grew up in the Bible Belt, went to Christian school in second grade for a bit until I got kicked out, where the left-handed kids had their hands swatted and they were forced to write with their right hands because the left hand was the hand of the devil. We don't generally think that anymore. So if you're left-handed, you're good, unless you want to be seen as being of the devil. But it's statistically you're deviant, right? And so a more sociological way to say that is, what if you're not white? I mean, we still live in a white majority country, and so statistically, if you don't define as white, if you're one of the other many shades of pigment, you are statistically deviant. And in the past, that's been defined as a problem. And people of color will tell you, I know that by not being white, I'm framed as a problem. And we're going to talk a lot about that and the sort of racist reasons that is. Another example of that might be people experiencing mental illness. Mental illness are folks who typically, are defined as not fitting the norm of what's normal. And you'll see me do this a lot in this class, these air quotes, what's normal. And mental illness has a long history, including things that were defined as mental illness that are no longer, like homosexuality. 1967, homosexuality was defined as a mental illness by the American Psychological Association. No longer defined as a mental illness, right? We've got kind of an evolution of the way we think about these things, but often things that deviate from the norm in the mental health category can sometimes be seen as being problems. Maybe some people with, varying mental capacities and neuro pathways might actually have some advantages. In some cultures, especially in some African cultures, what we would define as schizophrenic is being seen as having a voice and a pathway and a connection to the gods. That you're talking to people who are out there that the rest of us can't see, and that's a good thing. So there is a problem that's been defined because you're statistically deviant. More commonly, when we talk about norm violations as deviants, we're talking about behavior. People who are breaking the rules. People who are consciously breaking the rules. Going out and engaging in armed robbery. Engaging in sex trafficking. Engaging in white-collar crime. Engaging in political assassinations. And that is seen as an easier way of defining a social problem. We had this rule and you broke it. But one of the things we're going to talk about is what's the rule changes. I grew up in the Deep South where racial segregation was the law. That if you're Rosa Parks and you sit on the front of the bus, you're black, that's against the law. Now racial segregation is against the law, right? It's completely flipped the other way around. Now somebody would be breaking the law if they told Rosa Parks to go to the back of the bus. So it's often about sort of the social construction of that. I mean, we're going to talk a lot about how the drug laws in this country, especially here in Oregon, have changed. So there's a power dynamic in the norm violation issue. And part of that is labeling, how we label people. And I'm being mindful of I guess it was 2005, the Hurricane Katrina, when New Orleans flooded, and the way the news reported how people responded to it was very different. If a black person was seen breaking into a store to get some food because all the food had gone, out of their house, it was called looting. If a white person broke into a store to get some food, it was called finding some survival food. They had to survive. Okay, but there's a more sociological way of thinking about a type of social problem, and that's about social conditions. This is, instead of the micro focus, this is the macro focus, and we're asking, are people's basic needs being met? Is this problem the result of needs not being met? And here we're going to refer to something that will pop up a couple times this term, something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a classic 1943 model about understanding what social needs are. And at the bottom of this pyramid, and we have it here on the screen in front of you, are the basics, the basic physiological needs. You need food, you need water, you need shelter. And there are places where that's at a premium. You know, if you're in a famine zone, if you're in Gaza or you're in Central Africa, just getting food into you might be the basic priority. Like everything else, you know, doesn't matter. Just escaping the hunger pangs of the day or the lack of air because you're suffocating. You know, those are very basic. But then we go up to the next level and it's about safety and security. Can we be healthy? Can we be safe? Can we avoid bombs falling on us? And I'm guessing that some people in this class come from countries, maybe your parents immigrated from countries where safety and security were not guaranteed, where there was a constant threat of gun violence or there was a constant threat of war. I've had many students in this class who have come from places like Syria, where there is an ongoing threat, or El Salvador. So those needs have to be met. You can get some food, but you're worried about being shot. Then we get up to the next level of need of having those sort of social connections, love and friendship and connections to family and the opportunity to develop romantic relationships. Once those are taken care of, then we can get into the self-esteem issue, that you can work on your own issues. Can you achieve what you want to achieve? Can you set out on a path that you want to and achieve some status, for example? And then at the top is self-actualization. This is where you get to be what you are meant to be. Are you meant to be the next American Idol? Are you meant to be a great politician? Are you meant to be a great entrepreneur? Can you make that level? So at each one of these, there are different social problems, right? If you're starving to death, starvation is the social problem. And you're not worried about self-actualization. You're not even worried about love and romance. You need to just not die. When you get to the top level, the social problems are different. You know, we want to get people into college so they can actualize themselves. We want to give people opportunities for upward mobility so they can achieve their goals. But sometimes we refer to these as first world problems because in the lower levels of the pyramid, people are just trying to stay alive and not have bombs falling on them. So where we are on that pyramid are going to define a lot about the social problems, what the social conditions are, how are they being met or not being met. And often that has to do with the misdistribution of resources. That all along the ladder, there are places where there are biases. There are some people at the bottom that are getting access to relief supplies like food, and other people aren't. They're dying for, you know, some fresh water. And there are some people at the top who have access to college scholarships and other people don't. I mean, a really good example of the misdistribution of resources is in the criminal justice system. And we're going to talk about this, that there's so many examples of bias in the criminal justice system, especially based on race and class, that some people have access to really high power lawyers and they don't have the same problems that people on the lower end of the economic spectrum that have to, you know, work with public defenders have in trying to seek justice. A really good example of social conditions causing social problems or being a type of social problem is the issue of illegal immigration. Undocumented immigrants. I mean, this is a relatively new term, first of all. Until 1924, there was no such thing as an illegal immigrant in the United States, or no way of violating immigration law. But we have defined a category of people as problematic because they don't have the same access to the resources, and they're basically just working on security and safety while the rest of us watch their plight on TV. The last thing I want to say today in our lecture is about the issue of blame. When we think about the causes of social problems, and sometimes we use the language of blame, and that can be really problematic. So we tend to use, and there's sort of two things here as well, we tend to use sort of two approaches. One is what we call the person blame approach. We blame the victim. It's your fault you're poor. It's your fault you were a victim of violence. It's your fault that you couldn't get into college. It's your fault. We really look for individual pathologies. There's something wrong with you. And we do this a lot whenever there's a mass shooting or a shooting. We love to diagnose the shooters and say something about them. They're crazy, their ideology, their friends. You know, we look for something on the micro level. And that helps us because we can differentiate them from us. They're the bad people, we're the good people. And we create this what we call binary thinking of us versus them. Us good people and those bad people who are poor, those bad people who are drug addicted, those bad people who are violent, those bad people who are racist. We look at the individual as the source of the problem. Addiction. You shouldn't have tried that fentanyl. That's your fault. Now you're an addict. We did this a lot in the 50s and 60s and 70s with something called urban renewal. How do we solve poverty? Let's just kick all the poor people out of the poor neighborhood and redevelop it. Portland has a long history of urban renewal that blamed poor people for their living conditions. And it reinforces myths about the individual's level of control. How much power you have over your life. I mean, look at Oprah. She did it. If she did it, you should be able to do it too. What's wrong with you? The person blame approach is common, the most common, but sociologists prefer what we call the system blame approach. The system blame approach is much more sociological, and it looks at how systems shape our free will. There is a tendency for us to look at the individual pathology. You have this problem because you are not a good person. Like something wrong with you drove you into addiction. Something wrong with you drove you into homelessness. Something wrong with you led you to be a victim of sexual violence or racism. The system blame approach is going to look at social structures and how social structures shape our environment, including our choices. The clearest example of this, and we're definitely going to talk about this, is how people coming out of prisons, who've been sent to prison for committing some crime, often come out worse than they went in. They come out more what we call criminogenic. They become more hardcore crime committing when they come out of prison and went in. So that allows us to look at the structure, not the people as individuals, but the structure. There's a benefit here because, first of all, it allows us to look at social structure, which is what sociologists like to do. It removes the kind of victim blaming. It's your fault that you were attacked, like the focus on the individual blame. It kind of balances the micro and the macro, right? System blame is more of a macro level approach. And it helps us move away from individuals as the cause of the problem, looking at social structures as causes of the problem. And so in this class, we're going to address the person blame approach because it happens a lot. It's super common. We do it all the time. It's that fault. It's that guy's fault that he did that or that she did that. Certainly there's individual agency there, like free will is there, but those choices are shaped by the structure that that individual lives in. So we need to be able to at least address those factors as well to see the whole picture of the social problem. So we're going to focus on the system blame approach. All right, that's the end of the first lecture. That's hopefully gives you a little feel for how we're going to be sociological about social problems. I'm really looking forward to hearing kind of how you apply these to the social problems you're interested in. And I'll stop there for now. All right, there's another video up next.